Every leader has a strategy. Executing on that strategy is the challenge. If you want to learn how to effectively achieve what you've set out to accomplish, then this show is for you. Gain keen insights and listen in as leaders share their stories and challenges. SOAR Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation welcome you to LeaderDialogue Radio.
Hello, this is Duffy Dixon with Business Radio X. Thanks for joining us. Let me introduce our leaders of SOAR Vision Group. Ben Sawyer, the CEO. He has more than 30 years of executive leadership experience, and he has significant guided strategy deployment experience. And he's worked with many clients to achieve dramatic, sustainable operational performance, and you've greatly improved incomes. Also with me is Jennifer Strahan. Now, she is the president of Business Optimization Services for SOAR Vision Group. Jennifer, you've partnered with more than 100 health systems and businesses all across the U.S., and you help them transform their strategic and their administrative operations. Now, we are doing what we call a deep dive, all right? This is the show after we meet with a business, someone you've partnered with. We had on our show Lalabu, and this is, if you haven't heard of Lalabu, their slogan is Simple Babywearing. We met with Brian Foss, who's the CEO, and Cameron Glass, who's the COO. Now, they have a number of products to help you basically wear your baby. And notably, Maternity Magazine called it the 2018 Product of the Year, the Dad Shirt. And this is a shirt Dad wears with his baby right there. Now, he had the shirt on, and he had a toy baby, but the same size and weight as his baby. Right. And it was fascinating. He's got other products as well. Tell me, we talked a lot about their company, and they're in the midst of looking possibly for investors. What did you take away? What was the big takeaway from working with them?
So I can start. If I were to think about some of the key pieces that we really pulled out of last week's show is, again, they are at a point where they're looking for potentially investors for their company, which is interesting because they've had to do a lot to get to that point. And if you relate this all back to our lovely hierarchy of needs, which we refer to every single week, you can see some of the key pieces that they've really focused on. And the main thoughts that I had coming out of that were, one, they have really taken an innovative approach in capturing the customer's demands through innovation and being able to tap into those demands and bring new products to the market. So they really focused on not competing in an already saturated market, but really differentiating themselves and creating, if you guys recall from one of our earlier discussions, blue oceans. So creating a new market that is different from baby carrying with the baby wearing. The other things they've really focused on is how do they maintain a tight ship, right? So just like any small business, you have to really focus on how are we balancing all of the competing needs that we have for our time, our resources, and being able to remain financially viable as a company. And then the other thing that I just wanted to point out, and then I'll turn it over to you, Ben, is really around the culture they've tried to instill through looking at their leadership values, their customer and colleague engagement with the company as well.
And let me just continue on with that particular thought. So we don't often talk about leadership and values as it relates to the organizational hierarchy of need, but it permeates it. Because as I think we did mention, every organization exists in the shadow of the leader.
Right.
So if a leader is not a servant leader and is not understanding that the customer value is what comes first, and therefore the people that are directly interacting with the customer have to be supported to be able to be effective, the organization's not going to be able to be effective. So clearly Brian and Cameron have demonstrated that quality of leadership. There also were some interesting things in last week's radio program about value decisions they made. So one of them was that they bootstrapped. Right? They could have made a choice to do something different, but they chose to bootstrap. And the other thing that was a value for them was that they decided to give 2% back. Remember, they do these microloans for single moms in Africa, and so far they've done over $100,000. But they were giving that away when they were not paying themselves. That's a value statement. It just plain is. So whenever organizations are thinking about how to maximize their performance, and we've talked now to quite a number of them, those values and those kinds of leadership characteristics permeate that.
And it ties back to Baldrige. So if you guys recall, we obviously have our partnership with Baldrige. And when you look at the framework of the Baldrige Performance Excellence Program, it is one of the very first category is leadership, because to your point, it really serves as a pillar across every other component of the hierarchy of needs, and it will decide if you are effective in every other layer of your hierarchy.
Right, and the organizational hierarchy of needs this week was called by one of the Baldrige Examiner consultants that we work with basically a visual Baldrige. In other words, it's giving a pictorial representation of a lot of what the expanded Baldrige framework is all about, which is great. So we're dealing, when we're dealing with investments and investor profiles, with the whole comprehensive organizational hierarchy of need, and we got into that with them. So Jennifer, I don't know if you want to lead off with that as it relates to kind of what were some of the key and salient points across the hierarchy of needs that kind of stood out from last week's discussion. Mm-hmm. And then I also want to talk a little bit about some of the things we didn't maybe mention, which is no company's perfect. And we've been working with Lalabu for a while, and there were some challenges along the way, just like every other organization. And so we could talk a little bit about that because, again, when you're putting together an investor deck, it's everything that you're doing right. But when you're running a company, it's how do you continue to do the right things even when you hit hurdles.
Okay.
So it's an interesting concept because I think a lot of small business owners are curious about what this looks like. So as a small business owner, you are constantly wearing many hats, and you are, of course, encountering many different hurdles that are coming up, and you're trying to manage your day-to-day while at the same time balancing those hurdles, creating innovation in order to grow and continue to grow across your market or even new markets when you're going through that. So one of the things that really comes to mind for me is, and I want us to really dive into it more, is how do you get ready for investors, and how do small businesses start to think about that? Because that can be something that's very different and out of a typical business owner's perspective of what they should do there.
Right, and especially when does a business know that's something they should think about? And once they think about that, you guys talked a lot about it. You have to have your ducks in a row before you even approach people about being investors. But how does a company decide, hey, maybe it's time to bring on other people?
Mm-hmm. So fundamentally, an investor wants a return.
Okay.
So they're going to ask very focused questions on validating that they're going to get a return. What it's going to start with is, so tell me what you do. And if you go on for paragraphs, you just lost them. So what Lalabu can say is, we are simple baby wearing. Got it. Okay. So why is that significant? Well, because, and they talked about this last week, there's a large baby carrying market, but within that there's a niche of baby wearing that improves the quality of life for the parent and the child. Now, as an investor, I'm interested because I understand what they do and I see a differentiated value in the market that if I invest in, we can exploit and I can get a return. So that would be the very first thing an investor looks at is, tell me what you do. Is it significant? Is it something that if I put my money into, I can get money out of?
Mm-hmm. So it goes back to the very first 3 questions that we covered in our first show, which is, how do you differentiate your company? How do you make sure that you're engaging your colleagues to be able to act on that vision? And how do you make sure you're measuring performance and continually improving to grow? So those 3 things come back to your investor.
And let me tee off the last one, which is measuring your progress. So from investor speak, you're looking at 2 different things. You want to look at either the net present value calculator, which is really what kind of, if I invest, what kind of return can I expect based upon a hurdle rate, a reasonable interest or hurdle rate. Another thing they look at is something called CAGR, which is acronym CAGR, which stands for Compound Annual Growth Rate. So when we were working on the investor deck with Lalabu, they were showing a 31.2% CAGR over 5 years, which represented about a 289% return on investment. So that's significant. Now, in that context, an investor is also going to want to know how is the product recession-proofed, right? In other words, if I invest, I get it that you're telling me that there's that, but what are the market factors that, if it happens, would actually compromise that kind of a financial investment?
So just to give an example to listeners, and going back to Duffy's question on how do you know when you're ready, I'll give you an example. My husband does real estate, so one of the things that he talks about with clients and potential clients is, when do we put our house on the market? And it's the same concept with our businesses. So when we have a business, you can or let's start with a house. So if you have a house, it might be that you can put it on the market as is, and you will get X dollars for it.
Right.
It could also be that if you put a little bit of work into it, that you may get X dollars times some multiple, so you get a return that's higher. And the question you have to constantly ask is, as a homeowner, is this something that I want to invest in? Do I want to take the time, the money to invest in it and make potentially a higher amount? But there's a trade-off there. And it's the same concept with small businesses, or even any business, that you're essentially at the kind of the next phase to grow. And it could be that you need investor funds to be able to do that, which is a lot of the reason why we typically reach out to investors, to be able to grow faster or bigger than what we could on our own. Because if you don't need investors, that's essentially you're keeping more return in your pocket. Whereas when you bring in investors, you're also essentially sharing your profits with them. So being able to manage that tug of war on how much do I want to grow on my own, knowing it might take me a little bit longer, versus can I hit the market faster? Can I hit a broader market? But I'm going to have to share in that profit a little bit. So again, are you putting your house on the market as is, or do you want to invest a little bit and be able to get a higher return for it?
And I imagine that's a key thing you need to consider, because it all sounds great. Let's get more people putting money in. But you need to remember that means more money going out.
That's
and not
right.
necessarily to you.
That's right.
Right. Now, another thing that they brought up in last week's show was the decision to invest in patents and
Yes.
trademarks and copyrights. And that's just cost. You're paying patent attorneys. You're going through
discipline.
processes. And again, when you're bootstrapping it, those are really, really tough decisions. But from an investor standpoint, they want to know that you're protected, that you have something that somebody else is not going to just come along and steal the idea and that sort of thing. So those kinds of decisions are critical for success and also for being able to position with investors from the standpoint of attracting their input into your business.
Yeah, so it really comes to, have I had a short-term or a long-term vision? Because I can go through, and they alluded to this last week, is, I can not worry about my patents. I think Cameron talked about this, and bring in money now, or I have to invest more money in my patents and in intellectual property, but knowing I'm protecting my business in the longer haul.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to talk about this week, we just didn't get a chance to talk about it with them last week, is the whole notion of productive partnerships. And we haven't talked that much about this in the radio show, but productive partnerships encompasses a broad spectrum. So one part of a productive partnership is your channel relationships. And you heard Brian describe that he was trying to test out which channel would work best.
Right.
And he stumbled across Instagram and realized that particular social media channel was better than the other ones. And remember, he also said they learned fairly quickly that getting the product into consumers' hands was the best way to garner. So that is all about determining, when you're trying to tap into demand, which is under customer value, how are you going to use productive partnerships to make that happen? Two other things about productive partnerships are your raw materials suppliers. So, are you going to buy U.S. or are you going to buy international because of price point differentiation? What about quality? All those sorts of things. And then also partners that you have along the way that are helping you. And having worked with Lalabu for a while, there were some tough decisions that went on with that we can get into more detail on. But that's a big part, too, of company success, and also positioning yourself for being attractive to investors.
Who else you're partnering with.
Yes.
And how those partnerships have gone.
Are impacting your business, whether it's channel partnerships or internal raw material partners or just partners that are trying to help you.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about this, it ties back to values. Do you have shared values in leadership, either whether it's internal leaders that you're bringing on as part of your team, or if it's a different company that you're having a symbiotic relationship with mutual benefit? Those are things that you really want to know, because in tough times, your values are what stands out. And so if you get into a bind, you want to be with someone who has shared values across the board.
That is so true. And without getting into detail, that was one of the challenges that Lalabu had, was making sure that they had a partner whose values were exactly shared, that they could work together, make good decisions together, all that sort of thing. And there was a little bit of a struggle, and they worked through it. It was great, but every business has challenges, and that was an area of challenge. Another one that I recall quite clearly was when we were looking at the raw material suppliers, and there was going to be a significant increase in pricing per component. And because Lalabu is priced very competitively in terms of its suit shirts and so forth, that was going to be a big deal. So we had to work through a negotiation with that supplier to make sure that the price point was going to be fair and equitable and didn't reflect an increase that was going to be passed on to a customer. And I have to hand it to them. They negotiated that very well. But that's another example of a productive partnership that can waylay you if you don't know how to manage it and make sure that you're negotiating effectively.
So one thing I will point out, because I think a lot of businesses struggle with this, especially when you are a small business and you're not a Walmart, you don't necessarily have the power of the market that you do in a small business. When you're working on negotiations, there are a lot of times when small businesses don't necessarily think about putting in their contracts things like quality assurance, right, and making sure that you have to manage, the quality of the product you're getting in, and how do you respond when maybe that quality is subpar to what your initial negotiations or expectations are. And that's a challenge, I think, for a lot of companies, especially when they are not a big Walmart, and the majority of businesses we know are not.
Right. And by the way, this comes back again, not surprisingly, to value-based decision making.
Right.
Right. So what are you going to say no to?
Yes.
Where's the red line? Right? So if you have a definitive value about, for example, we're going to produce in the United States, and we want it to be produced there, you may incur higher costs. How important is that value to you? In Brian's case, it's really important. Everything is made in the United States. We had that conversation about using foreign companies or countries that you could get lower price points.
And he said no.
It was no. He really wanted to be able to build it in the United States. So that's an expression of a value decision. What you're talking about, Jennifer, with quality is another one. When is quality flexible? Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to do a large channel partner that is willing to do high volume and there's a lot of money, but they want to compromise quality, is that okay? Or when do you say no?
Right, and there's this constant balance with speed and quality,
yes,
right? So oftentimes, the faster we get, quality will often suffer.
Yes.
Or the more we focus on quality, speed will sometimes suffer.
Yes.
And we have to look and balance. So a really good example of this is if we look at the airline industry. So if you think about the airline industry, when they're going through takeoff and landing process and they're looking at the safety of flights, they operate on a very effective process. You don't hear about plane crashes. I mean, there are millions of flights going in before you ever hear about a poor incident. On the flip side, what do we hear about a lot whenever we're talking about airlines? We lose luggage or other things that occur in the service piece where there's a trade-off. Do we get our person there wholly, or do we get their baggage there all the time? So sometimes it's a question of, obviously if I had to choose, I want to be there personally in one piece, but on the other end,
you can always go buy whatever you don't have.
Yeah, it's okay. You can run to Target or whatever, right? So, but on the other end, it's a business decision, and I think values help reflect that, and you have to figure out what's our tolerance, both from us as a company, but also from our customer. What is a tolerance that they will not only accept because they have to, but accept because they're willing for
right.
It still meets their demand and their needs.
Right. So another expression of value that Jennifer and I happened to have lunch with Brian and Cameron before last week's radio show, and we talked about this particular expression of values, which I think is worth bringing up on this deep dive session, and that is there are some very valued associates that are Lalabu associates. These people have been at it from the beginning. They're working hard. They're acting like owners. And so as the potential of investors are coming in, potentially acquisition, it's important to get their voice. What is it that you want to see in 3 to 5 years? And once Brian is able to really get clarity on that, as investors are coming to him, particularly those that may want to acquire the business, that's a part of his value decision. So we asked him, we said, look, if one investor came in and was, for example, at $250,000 higher than another, but the lower one actually matched what your associates wanted from a value standpoint, which decision would you make? And he said, I would take the lower one.
Well, and that's easy to say. As Jennifer said, this is something that until you're faced with it,
correct.
How much do your values mean? And,
right.
And when times are tough, or when there's many other things that are attractive in the offer, so that will be an interesting thing. And that's something, I guess, that happens with every investor offer, right? I mean, I guess it's your due diligence to make sure, like you said, it's a good match, but that they're ticking off all the boxes for you as well.
Yeah, they are. So going back to the investors, they have a set of questions that they like to answer, but basically they all net around, is this a viable product that is well differentiated, that if I put money in, I can definitely get a return? That's the net. And when SOAR works with a company like Lalabu to help them put together an investor deck, we know what those questions are, and we help them compile an appropriate prospectus to be able to effectively answer those kinds of questions.
Is that a tough thing for the business owner?
It is.
When you do that? I mean, we've talked about anytime you're partnering with someone, it's tough because you go in and say, what do you do well, what don't you do well, and sometimes that is a big slap in the face. But I imagine it's really tough to say, this is what people are asking. And
correct, because the owner always wants to tell the investor what is really great about the product to them. Like, this is really cool, and this is why it's cool. The investor really doesn't care about that. That's not the point. What they want to know is it something that somebody will buy in a differentiated, high-volume way, and does it have a high return on investment, and is it recession-proof, and is it worth my putting my money in and the limited time that I have.
Right. So to your question, is it hard? Absolutely. Right. Because again, every small business owner, you have invested your heart and soul starting up a company, building a company. Different companies are at different points. They're at, I think, year 5. So there's still a relatively young company that's looking at this. You have other companies that, they're doing this 30 years in, or it's a retirement play that they're thinking about as kind of the next step. And when you invest that much time and energy, it's very hard to, one, think about someone else coming in to run it, right, or having a say in what you're going to be doing, or two, just being able to let go of that power in general. That's something where it's that control and that trust. So you have to engage your colleagues and your team, and whether or not you're still engaged in that business. Some people stay on as a chairman of the board. Some people stay on in a salaried capacity. Some people completely cut all ties. And oftentimes when you cut ties, that means you lose often some intellectual property. So there's these constant things that I would say, when you're thinking about investors, the best thing you can do is really sit back and think about, what do I want?
And you said, we've talked about this, that there's a number of reasons people look for investors. It may not just be, let's get bigger faster. It may be, let's give up a little of the control so I have more of a balance in my life.
Right.
Or I'm slowing down and I want, I'm getting a little older, that sort of thing. Right.
So there can be many different deciding factors that lead to this, right? One would be, we talked about business wants to grow, and maybe it's access to capital to help that growth. 2, it could be time or resources or expertise. It could be something that you just don't have the internal expertise to be able to manage or get to the next level. Really good example would be a company that's maybe a trade company, where they've had very successful business in a certain field, but maybe it's not their area of expertise to grow that into a franchise or something broader. So sometimes it's about marketing power, or it's a channel connection that they've already got contacts in different areas that can help bring exposure to whatever it is that you're looking for. So there's a lot of different things, or time, right? So we all have the same amount of time. So it's a matter of how do we engage our time in the most effective way possible. And I think this even would be, I would love for you to share, Ben, your story or your example with our bullseye in terms of really thinking about how do you get all of these things done, because we do have the same amount of limited time, but yet you look at some people and you're like, how do you do so much in 24 hours, right? Or in a year, when we both had a year and I couldn't even get a tan, and yet you're over here like solving world peace. Like,
right.
There's a balance.
I
right?
know those people.
Yeah.
Please, Ben, how do they do it?
So we had talked, I think, about this on an earlier radio program, but it's called Finding Your Platform. And I cannot take credit for this. This came from one of my executive coaches, a guy by the name of Roger Spoolman, who is very, very insightful. And so what he said to me when I was originally going to start my business is, you need to find your platform. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, what's that? And he said, well, think of a target. And the bullseye is what energizes you. So everyone thinks that time is the limiting factor, but everybody has the same amount of time. What's varying is energy. So when you're doing what energizes you, you are in your zone. You've been there. Time drops away. Nobody can do it quite like you do, and so forth. So he says you need to think back through your career as it relates to those times where you were truly energized, and because of that, you were in your zone making it happen, time dropped away, that sort of thing. And he said you'll get feedback from your colleagues and peers and so forth to say, oh yeah, that's you, like that's totally you. The second ring, if you will, of the target, so that's the bullseye, right, is your what energizes you. The second ring is what's your skill sets. So these don't energize you or de-energize you. You know, you're organized, you're a good communicator, or whatever. But they are important in that they augment your bullseye, and so it's important to understand them. The third and last outside ring of the target is what de-energizes you. So a lot of people spend their lives in de-energizing environments or doing things that they really are not particularly good at because that gives them, financial remuneration or whatever. But they live unhappy lives because they're not doing something that actually energizes them. So his point was, God made you a certain way. He gave you a certain set of talents and gifts. You need to identify what those are and be able to leverage them. And for business owners, that then translates into what they do. They should be doing something that energizes them. And the nice thing is it's unique. It's different than what others might have.
So what the challenge is for small businesses, you often have to have many roles. So sometimes you have to do all of these things while you're growing the company.
Correct.
Yeah,
which comes back to the question of, do I hire someone? Do I pay a salary that might be a break even in terms of what they might bring in, but it takes that off of me and lets me spend more time energizing or on something that energizes me rather. And so you have to kind of find that trade-off. It might be a vestor. It might be that we're going to not do this part of the company. A good example for me is I've gone through many finance courses, but I really don't want to sit down and do my accounting books. So I hire an accountant and they manage my books every single month. So
right.
That's something that I just don't want to have to do. And it gives you that balance to where I can focus on things that energize me and take things off of things that don't.
Right. And in your organization's team, what you're trying to identify is people who are energized by accounting.
Yes, exactly.
Because if you can give it to somebody who's energized by accounting, that's the beauty of it.
Right.
So within SOAR, what's interesting is what energizes me as the CEO is helping organizations and teams find their why and fulfill it. And that has been characteristic of what I've done for most of my career. Now that gets translated into a business proposition when we talk about what we do, which is everyone has a strategy. Execution is the challenge. We help you execute. Right? So we align people with purpose to achieve exceptional results and help you do that. That is an expression of my personal energy And then as I met Jennifer and connected with her on hers, and go ahead and take that.
Yeah, I've not heard this story.
Yeah, so for me, it's kind of a balance where I really like strategy. I like thinking about vision. I'm very futuristic and as I think about things, but I don't necessarily always want to think about all of the to-dos to get it done. So it depends. There's a balance where I can think about, I naturally tend to think about how do I get from step A to step Z. And at a high level, I'm hitting, okay, I have to go to D, and then I'm going to hit G, and I'm going to keep going through. But I don't necessarily want to see every single sub-piece. Okay. So I probably bring a little bit of a deeper dive into the operational mix of how to get there, whereas Ben's very good about looking at it and really seeing the big picture and bringing all these stakeholders and pieces together and orchestrating it. And then we have other people in our team who like the detail, and I'm so grateful for them because that's the piece I don't want to do, and they're very good at managing every single in-between step to go from A to B and B to C and so on and so forth.
And Ben, when you're doing when you're coming up with the people in your company, I imagine you need all those kind of people.
Correct.
Not everyone can't be the visionary.
That's exactly right.
Everyone can't be the leader. We understand that, but they do need to still have the energizing. I mean, what do you all have in common?
Right.
The why?
Well, yeah. So Jennifer brought up an example. Neither of us particularly like accounting.
My mother does. Yeah, she's
there
an
you
accountant.
go.
Exactly.
So it turns out
she loves numbers. I mean, I don't get it.
Right.
But she's still working at age 81.
Right.
She loves numbers.
So our Chief Financial Officer, Shane Sanders, is an incredible accountant. He has his master's in taxation, and he loves that stuff. So there you go. Pass it off, and away we go. So each member of the team contributes something very, very significant. So, for example, when I first saw Jennifer at work, and I saw her facilitate a mini Kaizen event, basically, what she was doing, and Kaizen, for those of the listeners, just means continuous improvement. It's a Japanese term that means continuous improvement. But it's basically you're getting a cross-sectional group together around a particular topic, and you're trying to figure out. There is no detail missed when Jennifer is on it. She reads the room really well. She picks up on details. She figures out how to pull it together, make sure that no one's missed, nothing's missed, and that the process is being followed to an outstanding conclusion. I've been doing Kaizen events all of my life. I'm quite a bit older than Jennifer, so I've been doing it for the last 30 years or so. I cannot do it that well. I'll just tell you right now, I don't have that same level of capability that she has. That's an example of the complementary nature of it, but you have to be intentional about it, and you have to know what you need to make sure that your team that you're building out complement each other and doesn't conflict.
Well, and you also have to be secure enough as a leader to allow that.
Right.
Really good point. Very good point. And that
we've
goes
talked
back
a lot
to
about
trust.
right.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So I want to get to this leader thing a little bit more. I think for our listeners, they probably have heard the news about Charles Krauthammer dying.
Yes.
And I was a huge fan of Dr. Krauthammer's, and they are doing a eulogy, I think, tonight on Fox about that. I'm sure I'm going to listen to it. But one of the things that stood out to me about him, beyond the fact that he overcame incredible hurdles to be successful. He's a high-level quadriplegic, and yet he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, and he went through medical school at Harvard as a psychiatrist after he had sustained his injury, which is amazing, and graduating at the top of his class. So the idea of overcoming unbelievable odds and excelling in spite of all of that, he's the poster child for that. But one of the other things that really struck me, and this is a characteristic of leaders, is that he spoke his mind based on what he believed to be accurate assessment. He didn't find fault with others, even if you completely disagree with him. He didn't demean you, but he would cross swords on ideas because that's what he believed in, and he spoke his mind. And really, a leader has an integrity to them. They communicate what they believe. They do it in a respectful way, and and they overcome hurdles. They keep moving forward, as Jennifer and I often talk about as a reference to your favorite movie.
Meet the Robinsons.
Meet the
for
Robinsons.
those wondering.
Oh, yes. We haven't watched that yet. Everyone, let's all
Yeah,
watch Meet the Robinsons.
It's a great.
It's still on my list.
By the way, it's a snippet of the Walt Disney story. That's actually the genesis for Meet the Robinsons. But the point is, leaders work off values, and that's their sustainable legacy. Whenever you find people that are basically just political, so they're going to do it because they want either visibility
Power.
or power or alignment with the right crowd, you don't have a leader. When you find someone that's willing to stand in the gap, move upstream, speak their mind even when it's not popular, do what's right, say no when it's tough to say no, that's what we're talking about with leadership. And then you see the evidence of success. And again, I've watched Brian and Cameron and Brian's wife Carrie do this, and that has been a hallmark of theirs, is they're going to do what they believe is right, even though sometimes it is painful. Like, I'm not paying myself, but I'm still going to give 2% back to single moms in Africa because that's something we committed to.
Right. And, one of the things that comes to mind as you're talking about this with leadership, and you mentioned integrity, it's authenticity.
It's authenticity.
People tend to migrate towards authenticity.
And people know it.
Yeah,
They totally
you can
know
see
it.
it.
You can't play the game. I
No,
mean, you
people will
can't
see it.
Yeah, you can't make up authenticity.
Right.
And unfortunately, you may not hear that about yourself until you're gone and they're
Right.
utilizing you.
No one comes up on a Tuesday and is like, Ben, I just wanted to tell you, you're really authentic.
Yeah,
It's just-
right.
Yeah.
But if you think about shows like Friends, just to put a plug in, I think it's Ross that goes out and holds his own funeral just to see what people are going to say about him. You can hear it early if you really put it in your
If you
mind.
really try to do it, yeah. But the point is, these are the things that make you. These are the things that people remember. These are the things that are your legacy. And leadership and the execution of leadership, which reflects your values, permeate the organizational hierarchy of needs. That's why it's not specifically articulated, because it is evidenced in strategy and execution. It is evidenced in how you manage finances. Mm-hmm. It is evidenced in how you approach customer value. It is evidenced in how you do organizational effectiveness. And by all means, it's evidenced in how you treat your colleagues.
And going back to our original discussion point around investor prospectus and putting everything together, they are looking at finances, but another key component of what they're looking for is the leadership.
Absolutely.
They want to see the culture and see what they're buying. It's just like when you look at working for a company, you're looking at, is the company going to be around where I have a salary in a year? But who am I working with? That's an important question, and investors are also asking that same question, is who are my leaders? Who is it that I can count on and that I know is going to get this job done? It's going to help us go to the next level. That's going to help us be able to achieve the things we want, like ROI and differentiation in the market.
How many times have you heard that when you've listened to business channels and so forth? I didn't have all the details. I wasn't sure exactly, but I really trust that leader. Mm-hmm. And so I took a risk and I made that decision, and it really paid off, right? That is a fundamental decision-making criteria, is, are you authentic? Are you integritous? Do you know what you're talking about? Do you inspire confidence? And if you do, people are investing in you as much as your idea and your business.
And just to relate this back to when we had Dr. Peck in, and we talked about this, and we said, if you put the customer or the patient first, finances will follow.
Right.
It's the same thing. So if you've got a leader in play who will put the right things first, your finances, your market presence, those things are very you're very capable of changing, moving, and driving those things in the right direction with the right leaders.
It's neat to see you bring in these businesses that already are figuring some of that out and pointing out their strengths. You don't just go in and point out their weaknesses. You point out their strengths. And each week, it's really interesting. There are different strengths of these companies, but all of it goes back to their leaders and making sure you start with them.
It absolutely does. Every organization lives in the shadow of its leader.
And that is why we call the show LeaderDialogue.
Correct.
Thank you so much for joining us for this week, presented, of course, by SOAR Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. Ben, Jennifer, I really appreciate it. It's been a really good 2 sessions here. And Lalabu, Good luck to them because
Absolutely.
they seem
Great
like they're
company.
they're getting some stuff done right. Thank you to our producers. We appreciate them so much. Remember to tune in every Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time to listen to our live broadcast. And you can also, if you want to listen to any of our previous podcasts, you can go to LeaderDialogue.com/podcast. And I should mention our producers. I just said producers. That's not fair. They're with us every week. Mike, Trey, and Nat. I'm Duffy Dixon. We'll see you next week for Leader Dialogue on Business Radio X.
Awesome.
Thanks, Duffy.
Thanks, Duffy.